to the
All
K-State
right.
Regen Ag Pod, where we talk all things regenerative agriculture here at Kansas State University, across the state of Kansas and beyond. I'm Nick Detter, your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Ifft and Dr. Nathan Hendricks of the Kansas State Agricultural Economics Department for a special cross episode between the K-State Regen Ag Pod and Dr. Ift's Smoke and Mirrors Ag Policy podcast to discuss the topic of how the worlds of regenerative agriculture and ag policy interact and intersect. Jenny and Nathan, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks
Thanks
for
for
having
having me.
us.
Yeah, well, I think just to start, Nathan, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background and what your current position here is at K State.
Yeah, so first I'll give just a little bit of my roots are that I grew up in Kansas. Actually grew up on a crop farm in northwest Kansas near the small town of Bird City, and then came to K-State, did both my undergrad and master's degrees here at K-State. Actually, in agricultural economics, I had two older brothers that went through K-State, and they both were ag econ majors. And I said, I'm not going to do ag econ when I come through K-State. And then I took the first ag econ class, and I was hooked. And so then I was in it and loved it. But then went to California, got my PhD, and then was excited to be able to have the opportunity to come back here as a faculty member. Have been back here as a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics for now about this will be 15 years at the end of this year. And yeah, just excited to be here. My research is kind of on anything related to crop production agriculture, as all those things get me excited and interested. And so kind of the main areas are in policy, land use, and water is kind of three main areas, but a lot of work at the intersection between agriculture production and the environment, but again, really kind of anything related to crop production agriculture.
Well, I'm excited to hear more about those details. And Jenny, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background and what you do here at K State?
Absolutely. I guess I'll start with my background. I'm originally from Central Illinois. Grew up on my family's farm there, so kind of typical Central Illinois farm: corn and soybean rotation and hogs. My dad and brother still farm together. They're actually, this will relate to what we're talking about there. They've really got into cover crops. They have a cover crop seed business. I'm not sure if they call themselves regenerative. We'll get there. But yes, it's still a part of my family's life. I've been at K-State for about 6 years now. I did my PhD in California, worked for the USDA for a while after that. Then I was at Cornell for a while. Then I ended up here again about 6 years ago to fill an agricultural policy role, and that's been really great. So I do research in a lot of different areas. Some looking at crop insurance and farm programs. Sometimes I look at non-traditional finance, or sort of the regulation of different non-traditional finance sources. And I have extension responsibilities, so I spend a lot of time doing farm bill education and also crop, livestock, and forage insurance education. So I guess before we get started, Nick, because we have listeners of two different podcasts, it'd be good if you could introduce yourself, and maybe we could get some kind of definition of regenerative agriculture as well as a bit about the efforts at K-State.
Yeah, well, that's great. It'll probably be good for my audience too. I've never actually really formally introduced myself. I'm just the host that asks the questions to my guests. So maybe they'll be interested, maybe they won't. My title at K-State is Regenerative Agriculture Extension Assistant. I got my master's in agronomy from Kansas State, and I actually just graduated technically this December. And I've been in my current position for 9 months. My position's a little bit unique, and it kind of ties into that regenerative agriculture initiative you mentioned. I think it was about 2 years ago. The university approved a university-wide regenerative agriculture initiative, and Dr. Chuck Rice is kind of the leader of that initiative. But we have people like you, Jenny, and people in ag engineering and animal science, and just marketing, kind of all over the university that have been a part of this initiative. And they got some funding to hire someone that's specifically kind of running extension work for this initiative. And so I'm the first one that's ever had that job. So it's been kind of unique to build something from the ground up. One of the byproducts of that effort is this podcast. We also do things like field days with the Kansas Soil Health Network, which is a network of on-farm research that Dr. Rice and other agronomy professors have been a part of. I think you guys are maybe even doing some economic work, hopefully, with that initiative or that network as well. We have a K-State Regen Ag farm. It's about, actually not, we call it a farm, but it's 100 acres as a part of the North Farm, just kind of north of campus, where we're starting to do explicitly Regen Ag research up on north of campus in that area, and I kind of help manage that and manage the logistics of that. I do other extension responsibilities like developing extension materials. I do some presentations. We're working on developing some trainings for farmers. And then the last kind of part of my job is we also have some private partnerships with some companies that are interested in regenerative agriculture, and I've been managing that a little bit. So then the big question is what is regenerative agriculture? I think that's the $1,000,000 question. I was actually earlier this week, I was at the Kansas Association of Independent Crop Consultants annual meeting, and they had a section on Regen Ag, and that was kind of the topic of, well, what even is this regenerative agriculture? And I think there are different definitions for different people, but what we have settled on here at K-State and kind of what we centered around is these 6 principles is really what we kind of think is the heart of regenerative agriculture. And those principles are minimizing mechanical soil disturbance, so that's limiting tillage, it would be another way to say that. Keeping the soil covered, managing residue, kind of related to the first one, and also related to this third one, which is maintaining a living root. That's just another way of saying that is maximizing the intensity of your cropping system. So as much as possible, having a living crop in the ground, whether that's a cover crop or a grain crop or a forage crop. And then our fourth one is maximizing cropping diversity. So having crop rotations, cover cropping can kind of fit into that one. The fifth one is integrating livestock. That one's kind of an interesting one, actually, because the actual agronomic and soil health benefits of that one is kind of the least studied and the least understood. But there's actually economically that's where we've seen that make a lot of sense and really make the rest of the system work from an economic approach. And then the sixth principle, and I think this is my favorite one, and I think what makes Regen Ag so valuable is it's understanding your context. It's none of these. It's not like we're prescribing a specific set of practices to any particular farmer. It's saying here are these principles that we feel like there's pretty strong evidence that over time, if you follow these principles, like they will improve your soil health. Hopefully, we're finding some evidence that they'll even improve the profitability of your operation. But we understand that farming contexts are very specific to their environment and the unique challenges that each farmer fits. So it's instead of it's tailoring these principles, like the last principle is tailor these principles to your specific circumstance. And so that's kind of how we understand Regen Ag. Well, do you guys have any thoughts or questions on that or response? Is that how you guys understand it, or as you guys have talked about it? And I guess this is actually kind of a good segue. When you think about regenerative agriculture or soil health as an economist, what does that mean to you? Kind of how I described it is mostly how we're thinking about it from an agronomic perspective. I mean, we want to get those other disciplines in there. I mean, we want to be holistic, but does how I described regenerative agriculture, does that line up with how you guys are thinking about it as economists?
Yeah, I mean that certainly makes sense for the types of issues that are interested in regenerative ag practices, and I think from an economics perspective, there's kind of 2 different issues we think about. One is the economics of adopting the practices and what would lead people to adopt these practices and which kind of people, and then also are there some kind of external benefits to those to people beyond on the farmer. And so then on that first issue of adopting that practice is that, I mean, ultimately the basic is that farmers are going to compare benefits and costs, right? So what are the benefits to them of improved soil health? Does that improve things like better yields, more resilient yields, and so kind of those better economic returns and some of the animal livestock benefits as well, and comparing to that to the different costs of adopting the practices. And there's going to be definitely some costs that are involved. And also within all that is, as we'll get to later, there's all sorts of policies that are out there. And so understanding the suite of policy incentives that are available, and which kind of policy incentives might make sense, and would they be willing to adopt with certain policy incentives, so that becomes a big part of the issue. And I think one of the things that makes this more complicated in regenerative ag, it's true of a lot of practices in agriculture though, is that some of the benefits may not be immediate, and they're likely uncertain, right? So information is really key about this, and is one of the ways that research and outreach can be really important. But also, giving farmers an opportunity to experiment with this and see what happens. But it probably has to be something where they're going to have to see maybe over multiple years to be able to see the impacts of these practices. And then also the risk tolerance of farmers is going to be an important feature here of, are they willing to take on a new practice, try that, or some that are less willing. And so different kinds of farmers may be more willing to experiment with this. How much livestock's already integrated in their system is going to impact some of this as well.
Do you have anything to add to that, Jenny?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Nathan covered a lot of things that affect whether or not farmers are gonna use these practices. I would add, I actually got started working on this project through an invitation from a sociologist, Matt Sanderson, who kind of said, "Hey, I want to better understand if how profitable these practices are." Because he'd been talking to producers, and the learning and management side, it sounds like it's a lot. It's really intense for a lot of people, especially at the beginning. So I think that's something I learned from him that's important. There's also the credit access. So our farm's going to be able to have access to the operating credit they need to continue their operation. For some farms that's an issue, for others maybe it's not. I think ultimately there are external benefits to a lot of these different soil health practices. Economists use the term externalities. So it's something that you do, say, as a part of a business or an individual or a farm, that doesn't necessarily influence you, but has broader positive or negative benefits. So smell from a livestock farm, that's a classic example of an externality. Runoff, that's another one. And so we talk about externalities, and when you have externalities in place, you want to have policies that could address those externalities. There's a couple different policy levers to do that. Basically, money or force. So we talk about money. That could be a fee or a tax. So if you do something that has negative impacts, we're going to make you pay for it. Or it could be more positive. So not a tax, but some type of a subsidy, payment for services. And this is where U.S. conservation policy, or sort of environmental policy that's implemented by the Department of Ag, that's really the direction. Almost everything is voluntary, and if you do this practice that has broader benefits, you could get some kind of payment. So that's where the U.S. is. The other one I said force. That's regulation. So saying you have to do something. You are not allowed to you're not allowed to put manure in a stream. Like, that's dump your manure in a stream. That's so there's certain things that you're not allowed to do. Or there's certain rules about how you use pesticides, how you apply fertilizers. So generally, regulations tend to be in the realm of the Environmental Protection Agency. If there's an endangered species, you do get some other agencies involved. So, and there are more regulations for certain types of livestock farms that are sufficiently large. So, that's, you can tax people, give subsidies, or have regulations. And I think what we have today in the U.S. is mostly a system of subsidies and regulations.
Yeah, so in what ways do you see this specific topic of regenerative agriculture kind of interacting with the current developments in ag policy? I know just recently the USDA had some announcement about, a $700 million regenerative agriculture initiative. So it seems like there's some interest, so, and even in our existing, conservation policy, where do some of these practices factor in, and why do you think the government seems to have an interest at this point, in maybe making some policy around this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we see that's going on in the policy world right now is a bit of a rebranding. Whereas a few years ago, climate smart was really where there was a lot of emphasis, and now you see that more towards regenerative ag. And even though there's a lot of overlap of the kinds of practices and what's going on there, and one of the things where there's some continuity there that I think is most interesting about even that $700 million that the USDA announced is that they were really trying to get private partnerships as well, right? So trying to get some money from private industry that would be paying for these regenerative ag practices. And so trying to link farmers, the practices they're using through to the value chain of food production, and creating value there where it's not just government payments for the money, but it's also the value chain. If they can see value to consumers of farmers using these practices, then being able to pass some of that benefit through the value chain back to producers. And so that's something we see in this initiative that was announced in December for the regenerative ag. And again, that's kind of similar to the climate smart commodities program that was in the last administration, was again trying to link some of the value chain, private industry to producers. So that seems to be a key theme of some of that policy of trying to get that private industry involved as well, and linking to the value chain through these regenerative ag practices.
Yep, yep. And I would add, if you go back to 1985, that's when the modern conservation reserve program started, and in dollar terms for over a decade, that land retirement, I guess it's a medium-term land retirement, you could say, with the conservation reserve program, that was the bulk of federal conservation spending. And then in the late 90s, you started having these working lands programs, equip. Nick, you're going to might have a acronym brain freeze. CSP, equip, yeah. Conservation
Those are
Stewardship
the two
Program,
big ones.
Environmental Quality Incentives Program. I did it.
Yep.
But yeah, those working lands programs started growing quite a bit, and so what you've seen is that the growth of federal spending on those has been much bigger than the conservation reserve programs. So now the majority of federal spending is through these working lands programs, which are very popular, oversubscribed. The other interesting thing is with the Conservation Reserve Program, I think nearly 40% of Conservation Reserve Program acres are now in the Grasslands Reserve Program, which can be grazed. So it's not just the Working Lands Program, the CRP program is becoming more working lands oriented as well. And so that was the context going into the summer. Then you have the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which took some of the Inflation Reduction Act additional funding that was tied to Climate Smart. It took some of that funding, that budget for conservation, and it put it into the long-term budget for conservation spending at USDA. And for me, that's a signal of policy continuity. Not everything lines up perfectly, but there's so much overlap there. And it does seem like regenerative agriculture, might be that big tent where you're, getting a lot of different people that care about the environment and conservation, agriculture from different perspectives to work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think like both of you said I think regenerative ag is at a certain level just a term that more people can kind of get behind, as compared to climate smart. But when we from an agronomic perspective, at least, when you think about like the practices that go into both of those things, there really aren't a lot of differences in terms of when we're talking about, using cover crops or, managing our fertilizer use more efficiently. Like those are all things that kind of fit under the umbrella of both, because ultimately what's interesting is like all these regen ag practices, one of the things they're most consistently shown to do is to improve your soil organic carbon. So whether you care about that because you want to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, or you care about that because improved soil organic carbon is good for agricultural productivity, I mean it's a win for whatever side of that issue you want to take. So I think that's encouraging for producers to hear, is that even though there's maybe been some change in terminology, it sounds like at the core of the policy there's some continuity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then there's a couple other areas I thought of that some innovations in ag policy that are happening, or at least potential revisions. One is the 45Z tax credit for aviation fuel, and that being linked to potentially being linked to farmers adopting regenerative ag practices, which again could open up that market for aviation fuel, but again tied to what practices producers are using. I think there's still some uncertainty exactly how that gets implemented, but there's that's out there in the discussion. The other is there's always there's been discussions about crop insurance and how if that should be somehow linked to practices, or whether farmers using certain practices should get a premium discount. And but a key thing is to have more data of if these practices really create more resilient yields, then okay, how do we adjust the premium if farmers are using these practices?
Yeah, that's really encouraging. I know with those aviation fuel tax credits, one of the encouraging things from an agronomic perspective is that just allows you, there's some crops that you can grow, that you can use for those sustainable aviation fuels that could allow some increase in diversity in cropping systems. So yeah, it's interesting, unexpected ways how these things can kind of align and benefit, this broader idea of regenerative agriculture. So my next question for both of you is just, we've kind of talked more about what's going on in the policy world and kind of an overview and a little bit of a history of how these policy questions have interacted with this regenerative agriculture. How about both of your guys' specific research? Like, what research have you guys been involved with that you feel like is shaping this conversation, or is helping you learn new things, and is maybe pushing the ball forward on I mean, you guys even mentioned is, can we prove economically how these practices have any relationship with consistency in yields or overall profitability? Do you guys have any thoughts or research that relates to those questions that you raised a little bit?
Nathan, do you want to go first?
I'll let you go first. I think
Okay. All right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know you already recorded a podcast with Delete and Caesar, Delete Joseph. He's a PhD student in our department now for his master's thesis. What he did was he uses an add-on survey that we conducted with the Kansas Farm Management Association. So it's about several hundred farms across the state of Kansas that use the KFMA accounting services, so accounting and tax preparation. So that's a really high quality data set going back to the 70s. It's also treated very confidentially, but we do have access to the data in the Department of Agricultural Economics. So what we did this sort of one-page survey with the K-State. We talked to a lot of people throughout the state, the Regenerative Ag team here, the Soil Health Network, and a lot of others, trying to understand what are the differences in soil health practices across KFMA farms. And so he explained it. But what we did was we looked at we collected that data, and then we joined it with their financial information. And some really interesting findings there, but sort of building on those is what I am interested in. So first of all, we tried to look at this data on practices, and then you have to say, well, who's the most regenerative? Because you can't look at 20 different things that a farm does independently and come to a conclusion. And this is a challenge for industry too. So if you want to reward farmers that do this, how do you figure out if they're doing it.
How do you quantify it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we had like over 400 Kansas farms that shared their information on practice, and we said, okay, we have to rank them, we have to score them, and this is Kansas, and these farms, they're different, but they're not like that different. If you look across states or something, and so we came up with 3 different measures based on what's done in research and industry, and they were pretty different, and that was pretty concerning because we know these practices interact, and we know there's a time dimension. And so if you're a researcher, how do you capture that? And so that's, something that's really showed that I'd like to see more research on in the future. I think, Daleed's going to lead a lot through his PhD research. In my role, one thing I am very interested in now is figuring out how we can get better data. The sort of foundation is you have farm level case studies, you have university field trials. The Regenerative Ag's program, has some long-term field trials. Those are really important individual producer experiences, but you also need to be able to look at sort of what happens broadly outside of case studies. And one thing that we want to learn how to use precision data. So, farms are collecting all of this data as they farm. How could you use that information to see how their practices have evolved over time? And then maybe there's a way here at K-State that if we can do it voluntarily and confidentially, very important, could we, use this information to look at financial impacts through the KFMA data? So that's very preliminary. KFMA is supportive, but we got to get producers on board. But that's where I really want to push this, to sort of get broader scale evidence on profitability.
But I think just to speak to that a little bit before I'll let Nathan talk, is I know when I was talking with Daleed, he mentioned there's 400 something farms that were involved in that study. I mean, we don't ever in agronomy look at things at that scale, So I think it's very important, like you said. I think that's a whole level of kind of viewing these questions that needs to be addressed, because at least in the agronomy space, that's not something we've done very much. Is, like you said, we have 7 farms in our network, which is good, and we have a lot of good data, and it's replicable, and we have field trials where you have replicable data, but like that's not the same thing as looking at 400 farms across the state of Kansas and trying to draw conclusions based on that data. So very excited to see where that goes going forward. So Nathan, how about you? What is some of the stuff you've been working on?
Yeah, one of the the topics I've been working on more from the policy angle is looking at the comparing cost effectiveness of either payments for practices versus payments for estimated outcomes, right? So the examples here are like EQIP and CSP programs that producers are familiar with. Pay for farmers to adopt certain practices, and it's a payment rate that's based on if you adopt cover crops or you adopt these regenerative practices, you're going to get this much payment. Versus some of like the voluntary carbon markets, so people have heard about those. And in those voluntary carbon markets, typically the payment was more geared towards you get this many dollars per ton of carbon sequestered. But with that dollars per ton of carbon sequestered, we can't, it's too costly to measure exactly how much carbon is sequestered for an individual farm. So it's always some estimate, right? And it's some estimate from some model, maybe some soil samples, but never an exact understanding of exactly how much carbon was sequestered, but some kind of an estimate of that carbon sequestered. And in the past, I would have always argued from an economic perspective, from cost effectiveness, is that the best thing to do would be to pay for the environmental outcome. So you say, if you want to sequester carbon, then you pay them for how much carbon they're sequestering. If we want to improve water quality, pay them for how much less nutrient runoff or something like that's happening. But as I've delved into this more, I've actually kind of changed my mind on this, which is, and the key reason for changing my mind is that there's always just an estimate of how much of those environmental outcomes, and there's going to be error. There's errors of how much you're doing, and so we've done some simulations and some policy analysis where actually just paying for practice can in some cases be more cost effective than the payment for environmental outcome once you have enough errors in the measurement, right? If we don't really know exactly how much carbon's being sequestered, but we're paying off of that estimated carbon sequestered, then what's going to happen is that you're going to overpay some people who aren't actually sequestering much. You're going to underpay and not induce some people that really would have sequestered carbon. And so that is going to, the incentives aren't going to align it exactly where you want. And so there's some cases where it just makes more sense to do the practice payment. And that even ignores the fact that, like within regenerative ag, is that often the benefits are multidimensional, right? Mm-hmm. There are water quality benefits, there's carbon sequester, maybe other kinds of soil erosion, different things. And so quantifying all those is going to be very difficult and have lots of uncertainty in that. And so there can be some cases when that's the case that actually the most cost-effective thing to do is just to provide a payment for adopting the practice and not based off of linking the payment to actual environmental outcomes. So, obviously if there's evidence that these practices are giving some positive outcomes. And so, so that's been one area that's been of interest. Another area that, I'm just really kind of starting to think about, haven't really delved into in depth, but just kind of starting to go down is really trying to understand the impacts of slowing population growth and deglobalization on agriculture. And as we look at that, one of the things that will, how does agriculture adapt in a situation where, mostly across the world, the population birth rates are going to be below replacement level. That's going to take some time. We've still got some population growth left here for a while, but how do we start to think about keeping that revenue coming to agriculture? And one of the ways is creating value added to agriculture, right? And so regenerative ag practices could be one of those, right? There's going to be lots of different ways of how do you create more value from the product, and that would be, again, a little bit of different way of thinking than how we have over the last 50 years in most of production ag. But how do we think about extracting more value from what we're producing?
So when you talk about like a value added perspective, is that consumers willing to pay more for things that are labeled regenerative? Is that, getting more? I think that's part of where the livestock integration sometimes fits into this a little bit. Is I was at a meeting, I think Jenny, you were at this meeting too in Garden City back in November, and a guy said, I can make a lot more if I run my crop through my cow and then sell my cow than if I just sell my crop, so is that where could you speak a little bit more to like what specifically you're thinking and what you're looking at when you're talking about adding value to the production chain from the producer side?
Yeah, I think you're right. Both of those, right? I agree of that. It is thinking about on the one hand of like livestock or linking somehow up to the food supply chain, so you're not just selling a raw commodity, but maybe you're selling livestock instead of grain, or you're selling something else, right? That's one way of adding some value to the agricultural production. The other way is creating value for the practices. So, right, if consumers do value, if they say, hey, I'd rather buy bread if the wheat was produced with these practices, and they're willing to pay a bit of a premium, then how can we get that incentive, what consumers are willing to pay, all the way through the value chain back to producers so that they're incentivized to want to use those practices, right, to be able to link that there.
Yeah, that's exciting stuff. I'm excited. Oh, Jenny, did you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I want to step back a little bit because we kind of touched on a couple different things from a policy perspective. So you want producers to do as much of these things from a policy perspective as on their own, as they could do. So, assuming you address the information problems, the learning, the credit access, if all of those are taken care of, there's some things, quite a bit maybe, that producers would do on their own. And if you sort of don't get to that level of adoption that's best for society, best for everybody, then you can talk about, okay, do companies need to step in, provide some type of premium, like, what Nathan was talking about. You want your bread from wheat that was produced with certain practices, or have some policy incentives. And sort of, it's a little bit abstract, but, in reality, you have all those three different things happening together. And then there's, issues of additionality and fairness. I think additionality gets talked about a lot. If you are, providing extra incentives for people to do from if this is taxpayer money, public money, you want that dollar to go as far as it can. So you don't necessarily want to pay somebody for something they would already do. This is why economists can be unpopular. What you hear a lot is, but from a producer's perspective, I've been doing the right thing for 3 decades, and I'm not going to get anything. And so I think that, that tension is very real when you think about policy design. I don't see it going away anytime soon.
Well, I'm still thinking through that one, so I'll have to think about that a little bit more, and maybe we could have a follow-up episode on some of that stuff. But yeah, it's an interesting point about how, when we make these policies, should we be rewarding people that are already doing the right thing? I don't know. That would, like you said, would be. I could see how that could make an economist unpopular if you walked into certain rooms and said maybe we shouldn't do that. So, well, to end on a how I like to end every episode is I just kind of like to open the floor up to my guests and just tell me something that's exciting you in your work right now. I think it's part of the purpose of this podcast is just to highlight the good things that are going on at K-State. So whether that's in the classroom or some other element of your research, or just it's a really broad, open-ended question. So that's how I'd like to end the conversation, is just have you both tell me something that's exciting you right now in your work.
Yeah, I think for me, just in general of what I see going on in some of agriculture right now that's interesting is a lot of local initiatives where there seems to be this increase in local initiatives where there's an objective and then they figure out how to address that issue locally, right? So that could be farmers in western Kansas thinking about how to conserve groundwater and extend the aquifer, but it could be farmers in Wisconsin as examples that are working to implement practices that improve water quality. And I think what is exciting about that is that as people get together, they think about how to innovate and determine the kinds of solutions that work best in their area. And so not these kinds of one-size-fits-all solutions, but really to say, hey, developing solutions from the bottom up. It gets a bit messier, but it leads to some, I think there's interesting to see how that plays out, and interesting to see that trend moving forward.
Yeah, it really seems like it aligns with that Regen Ag principle of understanding your context. I did briefly work at the NRCS, and that was one of the challenges sometimes with federal programs is, you have this policy that's written in DC, and then slowly people are like, well, how do we apply this, in Kansas? But then you have something like a groundwater management district in western Kansas where it's those people that are already there on the ground that are kind of designing the policy. So that is really interesting. Like that's maybe that could be a future episode to kind of discuss some of that as well. That's exciting to hear.
Yeah,
how about you, Jenny?
I think one thing I would add, we do a lot of applied research here at K-State, and I think there's a lot of policy change happening right now, for better or for worse, but I think there's an openness to think about what policies work best. So, having close relationships with commodity groups, producer groups are open to those conversations. Also folks at the USDA and other government agencies about, is there a way that we could make these policies work better? So I find that very encouraging.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up for this time. Thank you, Nathan and Jenny, for joining us. It was a very interesting conversation. I'm excited to hear what our audience thinks and maybe what follow-up questions we could have you guys on for in the future. So everybody, thank you for listening to K-State Regen Ag Pod, and we'll see you next time.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.